You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with columnist Carole Malone and broadcaster Steve Richards. They'll be with us from now right up until just before midnight. So let's see now what's on some of those front pages for you. Human rights pariah is the headline in the Metro after the United Nations voted to strip Russia of its place on the UN Human Rights Council over its invasion of Ukraine. While the Financial Times reports that a Russian aluminium company has become the first group within the country to call for an inquiry into alleged war crimes in the Ukrainian town of Bucha. The tax affairs of the wife of Chancellor Rishi Sunak are lead story in The Telegraph, with allies of the Sunaks claiming that Number 10 is trying to undermine him. The Times says the Chancellor is worried that revelations about his wife's non-domiciled tax status are a hit job. That story is also lead in The Guardian, which says she may have avoided up to £20 million in UK tax. But The Sun has an interview with the Chancellor in which he says, "Lay off my missus." The Mail leads with the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, calling for the NHS to protect women-only hospital wards as access for trans women to female-only wards is under review. While the Star reports that shoppers are panic buying a certain flavour of Walker's crisp before the recipe is changed. The headline, "Pack it in." Now, a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. Well, tonight we're joined by columnist Carole Malone and broadcaster Steve Richards. Welcome to you both. Let's start with the Metro and the headline there, Human Rights Pariah, and this in reference to Russia being losing its seat on the UN Human Rights Council. Carole.
Okay, sorry. It's been suspended from the council, as you just said, for gross violations of human rights. This is a very unusual happening. It's only happened once before. Libya was suspended in 2011 after violence against protesters by Gaddafi's forces. So this is quite a big thing. The motion was 93 countries voted in favour of suspending him. 24 against and 58 abstains, but the abstentions don't count. So what it meant was that they needed a 2/3 majority to do it, and so it's been done. But, I'm not sure how much Putin cares about that. We call him a global pariah. That's not the narrative that would be being peddled in Russia. And the thing is, he still controls the narrative in Russia. He no longer is able to peddle his lies around the rest of the world, but in Russia he does. And so I'm not quite sure how difficult this is going to be for him, whether it's going to make any difference to him at all. But we've been talking about the atrocities today, and we now know that there are. He's still. You guys have an interview today with Petrov, one of his spokespersons in the Kremlin, who was denying all claims of atrocities everywhere. But now we know that is not the case. And we now have proof. We have Russians talking about what they have done and what they're going to do with Ukrainian prisoners of war. So, this is difficult for Putin. It's like, your guy Petrov today said there was no chance that he'd ever be brought before a war crimes tribunal. Maybe that's what they believe. But the thing is, now we have evidence for that. But I don't think that much bothers him either, frankly.
Yes, that was an extraordinary interview with Dmitry Peskov today. Yeah. Steve, I just wonder what difference you think it will make, Russia losing their seat on the UN Human Rights Council. What difference does it make?
In the context of this nightmare in Ukraine, none at all, it seems to me. I mean, every twist and turn, some dark, some you think, yeah, it's good that the UN have done this. I always pose the question, does this lead any more clearly towards what form the end of this nightmare will take? And it seems to me this is an example of something that doesn't. As Carole suggests, Putin can control the way this will be presented in Russia, if it's presented at all, and it will be presented as, oh, these damn countries always against Russia and so on. So I suspect it will have no practical difference in terms of Putin standing within Russia. And it's hard to read. We're coming to a story which suggests there are some internal criticisms surfacing from within Russia, which may prove to be more significant, frankly, than this action from the UN.
Yes, and we know that the vote was 93 to 24. And Carole, one wonders about the 24 and what the future holds for them.
Yeah, I mean, North Korea was one of those who voted against. I've had a look to see if I can find the rest, and I can't. But some of the abstentions were Brazil, India, and Pakistan. Strategically, they're just not doing it. But it is interesting North Korea, you would expect from one dictator to another. You'd expect that to happen. But yes, I mean, I wonder if we will find out who the others are. And also the 58 abstentions. I mean, who are they apart from the three I've just mentioned, for goodness sake?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point, don't you think, Steve?
Yeah, although throughout this, there has not been, with some internal tensions, which I think will become greater as this goes on, there has been unity on the whole from the West, from the United States, the EU, the UK, and so on. But that hasn't been universal, and that's reflected in those who didn't vote for this.
Let's move to the Financial Times. And Rusal, the aluminium producer, has become the first Russian company to call for a public inquiry. That's into the alleged war crimes in Bucha. Carole.
Yeah, the Dutch chairman of this company has called for that. Steve knows more about this than me, but basically we don't know what's happening in Russia. We don't know what people think in Russia. We see what we see in the papers every day, but we don't know the truth. But here we have one company, one aluminium maker, calling for a public inquiry and saying that if it is found that Russia has been committing these atrocities in Bucha and various other cities, that the people Russia has to be severely punished. And it's a brave move, actually. You just wonder how many more companies might come out and follow this. Hopefully they will, because that will make life very difficult for Putin. It's a brave man. This guy is a brave guy to do it, but how many more will?
Yeah, Rusal's the world's biggest aluminium producer outside China. And Steve, just how significant is it for a Russian company to come out and call for an inquiry regarding Bucha?
I think it is quite significant. As you say, they're a very big company in Russia, and it tells us two things. One, that there is talk within certain sectors of the Russian community about war crimes. There is not just a blanket acceptance that these things are not even worth exploring. And the second thing is, this company is calling for an investigation. It is really worth exploring in terms of them. Now, it's very hard to read, and I haven't a clue, the degree of real support for Putin within Russia. I assume, but don't know, it's still high. But when you get this kind of quite powerful voice, because, the Russian economy is under all kinds of pressures. So when you get a voice like this saying, right, we need an investigation into alleged war crimes, I think that is much trickier for Putin to handle than what happened in the UN today.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about those people in Russia, us not knowing what they're seeing. Carole, I was speaking to someone, a Russian person that I met recently, who was saying that her family was divided, that her mother was extremely angry with her for not supporting the war in Russia. And they're simply not seeing the evidence that we are, and they don't have the detail.
It seems to be the case, Julie, that the older generation, the people who remember Mother Russia as it was, those people are supporters of Putin and will be till the day that they die. I think the revolution is being led by younger people. We've seen various things. We saw the guy this week, the artist, who lay down in a Moscow street with his hands tied behind his back, a very brave thing to do. But he was kind of making the point that this is what's happening in Ukraine, and so I think there are breakthroughs. I think the young people particularly are going to be doing this. They're the people who we have to hope for. But I think it's interesting. We talk about the economy. I read something today that said the economy is going to be set back 15 years by the sanctions that are currently in place. Just imagine how much damage we could do if we got even tougher sanctions in place. And, the stumbling block to that at the moment is Germany. They don't want tougher sanctions because they're still buying, those incredible figures today out of Europe, that Europe has spent 35 billion quid sent it to Russia for oil and gas since this war started. So much for sanctions. And actually, in contrast to that, Europe has only sent 1 billion in military aid. Now, that sounds like a lot, but it's not a lot compared to the 35 billion that they're spending on oil and gas. And that is shocking and shameful. And, Ukraine are calling again tonight. They're actually saying to NATO, we only have one simple request, and it's 3 words. It's weapons, weapons, and more weapons. And that's what we have to do.
Steve, you want
Could I just add a word of caution about sanctions? I suspect if the UK was as dependent on Russian gas as Germany is, it too would be pretty reluctant to switch that off and face the immediate economic consequences. And I would add just another word of caution about sanctions. Yes, it's hitting Russia and will continue to do so. But soon it's going to, especially if we don't, as I'm obsessed with how this is going to end, and one option is a sort of terrible war of attrition going on for a long, long time. We haven't fully tested yet the willingness of people here, in Germany, France, the whole of Europe, America, of the impact and the consequences of sanctions here, which are beginning to be felt. It's one of the drivers of inflation. But it will get much worse if the sanctions we impose continue. So that's another sort of wild card in all of this, how much economic pain the West is willing to take.
Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. Still with me, columnist Carole Malone and broadcaster Steve Richards. Welcome back to both of you. Let's go straight to the Telegraph and Rishi Sunak. His woes continue, but he's claiming that he's being undermined by Number 10. This is in the story regarding his wife's tax affairs. Carole.
I mean, I think it's spot on. As soon as I started to read this stuff yesterday, on the day the national insurance rates came into effect, we start hearing all these stories about Mrs. Sunak's non-dom status. This is not a new story. People in government will have known of her status for a long time, and it's just interesting. It comes out on the day the NI rates came into effect. Boris said today, what does it say? Keep families out of it. And I heard that and thought, well, that doesn't sound right to me either, especially when Sunak's allies are saying all this briefing is coming out of Number 10. And I completely believe that it is. Rishi Sunak, one of his allies said today he's the only credible show in town. And I think that's true. And he's always been a threat to Boris. A few months ago, he was looking very much like he could possibly be the next prime minister if Partygate hadn't gone Boris's way. And I do feel that people are trying to undermine him. And, I find it astonishing that in this 21st century we live in, people seem to imagine that Rishi Sunak should take charge of his wife's tax affairs. He should tell her she has to do them in a certain way. We should make it clear that Mrs. Sunak has done nothing wrong. The non-dom policy has been around for a very long time. Ed Miliband was moaning about it today. Well, Labour never changed the non-dom policy, and they have no intention of doing so. So I find this really, and to be having a go at his wife, especially Ed Miliband had a go. And, this is the man who a few years ago, when there were various stories about his Marxist academic father, went berserk and was saying, this is personal, you can't do this, and you're besmirching my father's name. There's not an awful lot of difference with what Ed Miliband is doing now to Mrs. Sunak. And I just think it's a bit rich for people to imagine that Rishi should have put his foot down and said to his wife, this is what you have to do. But I do concede that none of this looks good in a cost of living crisis when Sunak and his wife, who are worth, well, she's the daughter of a billionaire, he's worth millions in his own right. It does not look good at a time when, when people are struggling to make ends meet, when they're terrified whether they can switch the lights on.
Let's just bring Steve in. Just wondering if you agree with Carole that the Chancellor is being deliberately undermined and this perhaps has scuppered his chances, his ambitions to one day be Prime Minister.
I think this is a very big story, and if it wasn't for the hell of Ukraine, would be even bigger for two reasons. One, if it is true, as the Telegraph suggests and other papers too, that Number 10 are briefing against Sunak in utterly kind of implicitly damning ways, this bodes ill for the government in the next few months, because we all know what happens when there are tensions between prime ministers and chancellors. It's deeply destabilizing. But to be destabilized in the context of the cost of living crisis, inflation, and all the rest of it makes it even more significant as a story. But the other thing is, I think, that Rishi Sunak, if you don't mind me saying, I did a book recently on the prime ministers we never had. And one thing that struck me was nearly all chancellors who were seen as next prime minister never got the crown in most cases. And I've always thought Sunak was not going to seize the crown, because when you start doing unpopular things as a chancellor, your personal ratings fall. Now, if you throw in his vast wealth and all the rest of the stuff that's coming out about the non-dom status of his wife, I think he's in a really tricky position, having been the clear favourite to succeed just a few weeks ago.